It's July 20th, 2006. A man named Philip Marshall stands outside a Manhattan courthouse with a document that will destroy his own father. Inside that filing is a single sentence that will shock New York society to its core. My father is starving my grandmother to death. The grandmother in question? Brooke Astor, the woman who gave away $200 million to New York charities, the woman who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the woman President Clinton called America's guardian angel. She was 104 years old, and she was sleeping on a couch soaked in dog urine while her son paid himself $2.3 million a year from her accounts. Her nightgowns were so torn that nurses turned them inside out to hide the holes. Her son refused to buy her $5 socks. By minute 4, you'll see exactly how her son stole a $10 million painting while she watched helplessly. By minute 8, you'll understand the childhood wound that turned him into a predator. And by minute 12, you'll witness the moment Henry Kissinger took the witness stand against a family he'd known for 40 years. But Brooke Astor was just the beginning. Today, we expose 5 women from America's wealthiest dynasties, the Astors, the Kennedys, the Bakelins, and more. Women worth billions. Women who dined with presidents and lived in palaces. Women destroyed by the one institution that should have protected them above all others: their own families. This video contains descriptions of elder abuse, family violence, and psychological trauma. Viewer discretion is advised. These 5 women controlled fortunes worth billions in today's money. Yet when their families turned on them, all that wealth and status couldn't buy them safety, dignity, or even a clean pair of socks. Let's begin. It's March 2004. Philip Marshall arrives at his grandmother's Park Avenue apartment for what should be a routine visit. The woman who greets him is not the grandmother he knows. She's disoriented, terrified. She doesn't recognize her own grandson until he takes her hand and says, "We're family, we love you." The apartment, once the glittering heart of New York society, is cold, dimly lit. It smells wrong. Philip looks around, and what he sees will haunt him for months. His grandmother, a woman worth over $100 million, is living in conditions that wouldn't pass inspection at the homeless shelters she'd funded for decades. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to a birth that almost killed her, back to a violent first marriage, and back to the son who never forgave her for surviving it. Roberta Brooke Russell was born March 30th, 1902 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her father was a Marine Corps officer. Her childhood was spent moving between Hawaii, China, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, following her father's assignments. At 17, in 1919, she made the first catastrophic decision of her life. She married John Dryden Cuser. Cuser was wealthy, a senator's grandson, and he was a monster. What happened behind closed doors would define everything that came after. According to Brooke's own later accounts, Cuser drank heavily. He committed adultery openly, and he beat his young wife with disturbing regularity. When Brooke was 6 months pregnant with their only child, her husband struck her during an argument. He broke her jaw. That child, born into violence, carried by a mother whose jaw was still healing, was Anthony Dryden Cuser, the son who would one day orchestrate her destruction. Brooke endured 11 years of that marriage before escaping in 1930. She took her 6-year-old son and what little money she could claim. The divorce left her with almost nothing. But here's what matters for our story. Young Tony witnessed that violence. He knew what his father had done to his mother, and some part of him, according to those who knew the family, never forgave her for any of it. After a genuinely happy second marriage to Charles "Buddy" Marshall, who died of a heart attack in 1952, Brooke made the match that would define her legend. In 1953, she married Vincent Astor. Vincent was the temperamental heir to one of America's greatest fortunes. His father, John Jacob Astor IV, had died on the Titanic in 1912. The loss, combined with a cold upbringing, left Vincent prone to what Brooke called profound sadness. She later admitted she had loved Buddy far more than Vincent, but Vincent had something Buddy never had: money. When Vincent died in February 1959, Brooke inherited a trust valued between $60 and $65 million, roughly $500 million in today's money. She also received control of the Vincent Astor Foundation. And for the next 40 years, she did something extraordinary with it. Between 1959 and 1997, Brooke Astor gave away approximately $200 million. That's not a typo, $200 million to New York institutions. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Public Library, Carnegie Hall, the Bronx Zoo, the Museum of Natural History, Central Park. But here's what made her different from every other wealthy donor. She showed up. Dressed in Chanel suits and white gloves, Brooke personally visited every single homeless shelter, housing project, and community center she funded. She didn't just write checks. She walked the floors. She talked to the people her money was helping. She had a saying she loved to quote from Thornton Wilder's play, The Matchmaker. "Money is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around." Former Mayor Abraham Beame declared that Brooke Astor had done more for New York City than any other one person. In 1998, President Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was 96 years old, at the peak of her influence, the undisputed queen of New York society. And in the shadows, her son was already calculating. Now you might be wondering, how does a mother who gives away $200 million to strangers end up abused by her own child? To understand that, we need to understand Anthony Dryden Marshall. Tony entered the world on May 30th, 1924. His conception, according to implications Brooke made in her autobiography, may have occurred during a violent encounter. His father had already broken his mother's jaw while she carried him. Brooke never really bonded with her son. She later admitted this to friends. When she divorced Cuser and married Buddy Marshall, 8-year-old Tony was sent away to boarding schools. Buddy never adopted him, never fully welcomed him into the family. Tony spent his childhood feeling like an outsider in his own family, the son of a monster, raised by a mother who seemed to prefer everyone else. And when Brooke married Vincent Astor in 1953, the rejection intensified. Vincent despised Tony, openly, vocally. Brooke shut her son out of her life to satisfy her wealthy third husband. "He never accomplished anything," Brooke told friends about Tony. She later admitted he had disappointed her so thoroughly that she decided against having more children. Here's the thing that makes this story complicated. Tony Marshall did accomplish things, significant things. He served as a Marine in World War II and earned a Purple Heart after leading his platoon at Iwo Jima. He joined the CIA afterward and contributed to the development of the U-2 spy plane program. The State Department appointed him U.S. ambassador to 4 different nations: Madagascar, Trinidad and Tobago, Kenya, and the Seychelles. He won a Tony Award as a Broadway producer. By any reasonable standard, Anthony Marshall was successful. But in his mother's eyes, he was a failure, a disappointment, the son she'd never wanted from the marriage she'd barely survived. The relationship operated through what observers called a tremendous push-pull. Brooke demanded Tony's presence while withholding the approval he desperately craved. And then in 1992, everything changed. Tony was 68 years old. 2 marriages had ended in divorce. His relationship with his mother remained toxic. Then he married Charlene Gilbert. Charlene had been the wife of an Episcopal minister at Brooke's church in Maine. For 2 decades, she'd lived modestly as a minister's wife, serving the wealthy summer residents, including the Astors. By 1989, Charlene had begun arriving at Brooke's Maine estate for early morning walks with Tony. The minister's wife left her husband for the ambassador's son. They married in 1992. Brooke was 90 years old, and she was already showing early signs of cognitive decline. Brooke Astor loathed her new daughter-in-law. She called Charlene that, not by her name, just that. Staff nicknamed Charlene Miss Piggy, for what they perceived as greed and social climbing. Multiple witnesses later testified at trial that Charlene wore the pants in the marriage. Tony made no decision without consulting her first. In 2000, Brooke received a diagnosis that would change everything: Alzheimer's disease. Tony kept the diagnosis hidden, even as his mother's mental state deteriorated visibly. Even as friends noticed, she repeated herself constantly and failed to recognize long-time acquaintances. And while Brooke's mind crumbled, Tony and Charlene saw something they recognized immediately: An opportunity. This is Flag's Fifth Avenue by Child Hassam. It's an impressionist masterpiece depicting a bustling New York street scene, festooned with American flags. Brooke Astor purchased it in 1970 for $172,000. For 32 years, it hung above her library fireplace. It was her favorite painting, the first thing she saw every morning. In February 2002, Tony convinced his mother, already showing clear signs of dementia, to sell it. He told her she needed the money, that she couldn't afford new dresses until she sold the painting. Think about that for a moment. A woman with over $150 million in assets, an annual income of approximately $2 million from her trust, and her son told her she was too poor to buy new dresses. With her Alzheimer's impaired judgment, she believed him. Tony sold the painting to a Santa Fe art dealer for $10 million, several million more than any Hassam had previously sold for at auction. And Tony, he took a $2 million commission. $2 million from his own mother for selling her favorite painting while she was too mentally impaired to understand what was happening. The dealer later resold it for between $20 and $25 million. Brooke never saw a penny beyond losing the artwork she loved. But the painting was just the beginning. Between 2001 and 2007, while Brooke's Alzheimer's destroyed her capacity for informed decisions, Tony worked with attorneys to add 3 codicils, amendments to her 2002 will. Each one redirected money from the charities Brooke had supported for decades. Each one put more money under Tony's control. The third codicil, dated March 3, 2004, became the centerpiece of the forgery investigation. Handwriting expert Gus Lesnovich examined 240 known Brooke Astor signatures from 1953 to 2004. When he looked at the third codicil signature, he knew immediately. No doubt that it's not Brooke Astor's signature. The signature was written too smoothly for someone with advanced Alzheimer's. The letters were connected in ways Brooke never connected them. It bore telltale signs of being traced over. Someone had forged it. Meanwhile, Tony gave himself a 208% raise. His annual compensation went from $450,000 to between $2.3 and $2.5 million. While his mother couldn't remember her own grandchildren's names. Now let me show you what Brooke Astor's life looked like while her son was paying himself millions. According to court testimony from nurses, staff, and Philip Marshall's guardianship petition, the 104-year-old woman slept on a couch soaked in dog urine. Her nightgowns were so torn and frayed that nurses turned them inside out to hide the damage. Her beloved dogs, Boise and Girlsey, were locked away in a pantry, forbidden from being near her. Her diet, pureed peas, carrots, and oatmeal. No gourmet meals from the French chef Tony had fired to cut costs. Expensive face creams were replaced with petroleum jelly. When nurses requested $5 to $10 for non-skid socks to prevent her from falling, Tony denied the request. The nurses bought the socks with their own money. Tony refused to purchase a bed with rails, even though she had fallen multiple times. He reduced her medications, limited her doctor visits, and he ordered staff never to take her to an emergency room, never to call 911 without contacting him first. The woman who gave away $200 million wasn't allowed $5 socks. Philip Marshall faced an agonizing choice in 2006. Expose his own father's abuse, or watch his grandmother suffer until death. Think about that position. To save your grandmother, you have to destroy your father. You have to sacrifice your inheritance. You have to tear your family apart publicly in front of the entire world. On July 20, 2006, Philip made his choice. He filed a guardianship petition in New York court, seeking to remove Tony as Brooke's legal guardian. The petition contained allegations so serious, so disturbing, that when it became public 6 days later, New York society reacted with horror usually reserved for discovering medieval torture chambers in penthouse apartments. The headlines exploded. Disaster for Mrs. Astor. Details about the dog urine-soaked couch, the torn nightgowns, the pureed peas, the denied medications, all of it spilled across tabloid pages. Philip had rallied extraordinary support. Annette de la Renta, Brooke's closest friend, filed an affidavit supporting the guardianship change. David Rockefeller added his voice, and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Some of the most powerful people in America were testifying against Anthony Marshall. A judge granted Philip's emergency request immediately. Tony was stripped of all authority over his mother. Annette de la Renta became temporary guardian. J.P. Morgan Chase took over the finances. Brooke spent her final year at Holly Hill. The estate Philip had reopened, fully staffed with proper care, surrounded by the beauty and dignity she deserved. She died on August 13, 2007, at age 105. The criminal investigation had already begun. What prosecutors uncovered led to what they called Grand Theft Astor. On October 8, 2009, after 5 months of testimony and 12 contentious days of jury deliberation, 85-year-old Anthony Marshall was convicted on 14 criminal counts. Grand larceny, conspiracy, scheming to defraud. His co-defendant, attorney Francis X. Morrissey, Jr., was found guilty on all 6 counts against him, including forgery. The trial had featured testimony from Henry Kissinger, Barbara Walters, Annette de la Renta, David Rockefeller, and Vartan Gregorian. Justice A. Kirk Bartley, Jr., sentenced Tony to 1 to 3 years in prison on December 21, 2009. He was 85 years old. But here's where the justice system failed. Tony Marshall served only 8 weeks at Fishkill Correctional Facility before a parole board granted medical release on August 22, 2013, citing Parkinson's disease and congestive heart failure. He died on November 30, 2014, at age 90. He never expressed genuine remorse. The estate settlement in March 2012 recognized Brooke's 2002 will as valid, rejecting all 3 codicils. After paying a $12 million fine, estate taxes, and more than $11 million in legal fees, Tony's actual inheritance was reduced to less than $3 million. The remaining $100 million went to charities, exactly as Brooke had intended. $20 million to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, $15 million to the New York Public Library, $30 million to create the Brooke Astor Fund for New York City education. Millions more to institutions from the Brooklyn Museum to the Wildlife Conservation Society. Philip Marshall, who lost his $9 million inheritance when his father cut him from the will, never regretted his decision. He left his university position to found Beyond Brooke, a nonprofit dedicated to elder justice advocacy. Brooke Astor's gravestone at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery bears the inscription she requested. "I had a wonderful life." Heartbreaking words from a woman whose final years were defined by isolation, degradation, and betrayal. At the hands of the son she bore 83 years earlier, in a violent marriage she barely survived. A son who never forgave her for choosing everyone else first, and who extracted his revenge when she was most vulnerable. Here's what I keep thinking about. Philip Marshall sacrificed $9 million and his relationship with his own father to save his grandmother. The nurses bought socks with their own money because Tony wouldn't approve the expense. But for years before Philip intervened, people knew. The staff at 778 Park Avenue saw the conditions. The doctors documented the decline. Friends noticed Brooke wasn't herself. And no one did anything. Would you have done differently? Would you have sacrificed your inheritance, your family ties, your place in New York society? Or would you have convinced yourself it wasn't your business? I'd love to hear your honest answer in the comments. Not what you think you should do, what you honestly think you would do. Because this pattern, people knowing and doing nothing, repeats in every story we're about to examine. Brooke Astor's story is horrifying because her son exploited her vulnerability for money. But the next story I'm about to tell you is different. Darker, more twisted, and infinitely more disturbing. Because in this case, the victim didn't just become a victim. She became a perpetrator first. And the violence that ended her life, she created it herself. They called her the Plastic Princess, a cruel joke that masked an even crueler truth. Barbara Bekeland married into the fortune that invented modern plastic, a material that transformed the 20th century. She graced the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She hosted Europe's intellectual elite at her Paris apartment. And in 1972, in her Chelsea apartment in London, her own son stabbed her to death with a kitchen knife. What drove him to do it? The answer is so disturbing that some viewers may want to skip ahead. But if you want to understand how wealth and mental illness and family dysfunction can combine into tragedy, you need to hear this story. Coming up, the plastic princess who tried to fix her son and created a murderer instead. It's November 17, 1972, London, Chelsea. A woman lies dead on the floor of her expensive apartment. She's 51 years old, still beautiful, still wearing the remnants of a life spent in luxury. The knife is still in her body. Her killer doesn't run. He walks to the telephone. He calls a local Chinese restaurant. He orders a meal. And then he sits down and eats with his mother's body 3 feet away. When police arrive, Anthony Beekellen doesn't resist, doesn't show emotion, doesn't seem to understand what he's done. He's 26 years old. He's been diagnosed with schizophrenia. His father refused psychiatric treatment for years. And his mother did something to him that court documents would later describe only in clinical terms. Something so unthinkable that, when she announced her intentions at a Paris dinner party, multiple guests got up and left. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to a father's suicide, back to a marriage built on lies, and back to the obsession that destroyed them both. Barbara Dolly was born September 28, 1921, into a family that was nothing like the one she would later claim. Her father, Frank Dolly, was a tubercular telegrapher who dreamed of bigger things but never achieved them. In January 1933, when Barbara was 11 years old, her father took his own life. He left behind unpaid bills, unanswered questions, and a daughter who would spend her entire life trying to outrun his shadow. Her mother's subsequent mental decline cast Barbara adrift. But Barbara possessed weapons more potent than wealth. She was stunning. Beauty that turned heads, a quick, savage wit that could charm or destroy with equal ease. She graced the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. Photographers competed to capture her. Each step was calculated, each relationship a potential ladder to the life she craved. And in the early 1940s, she found the ladder she was looking for. Brooks Beekellen, grandson of Leo Beekellen, the inventor of Bakelite, the world's first synthetic plastic. The Beekellen name meant innovation. It meant money. It meant a future Barbara's father could never have imagined. The marriage began with deception. According to later accounts, Barbara claimed she was pregnant to force Brooks's hand. It was a lie, but by the time he discovered it, they were already married. From the very beginning, their union was built on manipulation. On August 28, 1946, Barbara gave birth to their only child. Anthony Beekellen, born into tremendous privilege, born into profound dysfunction, and born, according to specialists who would later examine him, with a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia that neither parent recognized. In 1954, when Anthony was 8, the Beekellens abandoned any pretense of normal life. They left New York for a nomadic existence that would define the next 2 decades. Paris, Madrid, the Costa Brava, luxury hotels, rented villas. No stability, no consistent schooling, no structure. And no treatment for the mental illness that was slowly consuming their son. Brooks pursued artistic ambitions half-heartedly, more interested in collecting experiences than creating anything lasting. Barbara fashioned herself as a writer and intellectual, hosting elaborate parties where she would recite her poetry to captive audiences. And Anthony watched from the shadows, growing stranger, growing more isolated, growing more dangerous. As Anthony entered adolescence, the first serious signs of trouble emerged. He was highly intelligent, but deeply sensitive. He struggled in school despite obvious gifts. Teachers noted his tendency to withdraw into fantasy worlds. Classmates found him strange and difficult to approach. The signs of schizophrenia were becoming apparent to anyone paying attention. But Brooks refused psychiatric treatment for his son. And Barbara became obsessed with a different problem. Anthony's sexuality. In the libertine world of 1960s European expatriate society, Anthony's emerging identity should have been unremarkable. But Barbara saw it as failure, as rejection, as something that needed to be fixed. And she decided to fix it. At a dinner party in their Paris apartment, Barbara made an announcement that silenced the room. Her solution to what she saw as her son's problem was to arrange encounters with women, to hire companions who would, she believed, cure him. Several guests left immediately. When those arrangements failed to achieve her desired result, Barbara's measures grew more desperate, more extreme, more unthinkable. I need to pause here. What I'm about to tell you is documented in court records, in testimony, and in accounts from people who knew the family. But I'm going to describe it carefully because the reality is almost unbearable. In 1967, Barbara Bekeland crossed a boundary so fundamental, so unthinkable, that court documents describe it only in clinical terms. She believed, truly believed, that what she was doing would cure her son. What prosecutors would later call an unnatural relationship began between mother and son. It persisted for years, and it destroyed whatever remained of Anthony's fragile mind. In 1968, Brooks Bekeland fled. He escaped the toxic nightmare his family had become by leaving Barbara for a younger woman, his son's friend. The abandonment pushed Barbara deeper into her obsession with Anthony, and Anthony, now in his 20s, schizophrenic, traumatized, grew increasingly violent. The warning signs were everywhere. In the early 1970s, Anthony attacked his mother repeatedly. He tried to strangle her. He attempted to throw her under the wheels of a moving car. Each time Barbara forgave him, refused to press charges, pulled him back into their toxic orbit. Friends who witnessed these episodes were powerless to intervene. What could they do? Call the police on a wealthy family. The world of social privilege that had once seemed to promise them everything now served only to enable their mutual destruction. Barbara used her connections to smooth over violent incidents. Her money ensured that Anthony's increasingly erratic behavior wouldn't lead to lasting consequences. Despite his diagnosed schizophrenia, despite the violence, despite everything, Barbara refused to acknowledge that her son was dangerous. November 17, 1972. Barbara Bekeland is 51 years old. She's been sharing a small but expensive apartment with her son in London's Chelsea district. She's recently told friends that she believes she's finally curing Anthony through their relationship. She couldn't have known that she was running out of time. That afternoon, something triggers Anthony. The violence that had been building for years, the violence she had created through her own actions, finally erupts. He picks up the kitchen knife. She doesn't run. The blade comes down. Then again. Then again. Barbara Bekeland dies on the floor of her Chelsea apartment. Her son, the child she bore, the boy she damaged, the man she destroyed, stands over her. And then he calls for Chinese food. The London press descended on the story. Wealth, scandal, murder. A family that had revolutionized the modern world through the invention of Bakelite was now notorious for something far darker. Anthony was found guilty but insane. He was committed to Broadmoor Hospital, Britain's highest security psychiatric facility, the same institution that had housed some of the country's most dangerous mentally ill patients. He spent 8 years there. And then in 1980, something inexplicable happened. A group of Anthony's friends successfully lobbied for his release, despite strong objections from psychiatrists who considered him still dangerous. He was deported to America immediately. 6 days after arriving in New York, Anthony attacked his grandmother with a kitchen knife. He was arrested, sent to Rikers Island. On March 20th, 1981, the day he expected to be released on bail, his case was delayed due to complications in transferring his medical records from Britain. That same day, Anthony Bekeland took his own life in his cell. He was 33 years old. The grandson of the man who invented plastic died by plastic. A dark irony that seems almost too cruel to be coincidence. The family that had molded modern life couldn't mold a functional family. The beautiful woman who graced the pages of Vogue, died at the hands of her own creation. And the son who was never given the psychiatric treatment he needed, whose illness was ignored, whose trauma was caused by his own mother, became both victim and perpetrator in a tragedy that was entirely preventable. Here's the question I can't stop thinking about. Brooks Bekeland knew his son was dangerous. He knew about the violence. He knew about the schizophrenia. And he refused psychiatric treatment. At what point does denial become complicity? At what point does a father who won't get his son help become responsible for what happens next? And what about Barbara? She was a victim, too, of her own childhood trauma, of her father's suicide, of a society that told women their value lay in beauty and marriage. But she was also a perpetrator. She crossed a boundary that no parent should ever cross, and she created the monster who killed her. Who do you blame? The father who abandoned his family. The mother who damaged her son beyond repair. The son who was never given the help he needed. Or the society that looked away because the Bekelands were wealthy, glamorous, and above suspicion. I genuinely don't know the answer. Let me know in the comments what you think. Barbara Bekeland's story is tragedy born of dysfunction, a mother's twisted love destroying both herself and her son. But the next story is different. It's not about love gone wrong. It's about love that never existed. It's about a father who saw his daughter not as a person to protect, but as a problem to solve. And his solution was so barbaric, so permanent, that when his wife finally learned the truth 20 years later, she couldn't believe what he had done. This is Rose Mary Kennedy, sister to a president, daughter of America's most ambitious dynasty, and victim of one of the most horrifying medical procedures ever performed on a conscious human being. Her father didn't lock her away because she misbehaved. He didn't hide her because she was difficult. He destroyed her brain because he was afraid she might embarrass his sons. Coming up, the Kennedy daughter they erased from history, and the surgery that was supposed to fix her. It's November 20th, 1941, Washington, D.C. A 23-year-old woman lies on an operating table at George Washington University Hospital. She's awake. She's been given only local anesthesia. She can feel pressure. She can hear the surgeons talking. She can follow their commands. They've drilled 2 holes in her skull, 1 on each side. Now they're inserting a spatula-like instrument into her brain tissue. They're about to sever the neural connections of her prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for personality, judgment, planning, and emotional regulation. But they need her to stay awake. They need her to respond. It's the only way they'll know when to stop cutting. Sing for us, Rosemary. And she does. She sings God Bless America while they cut into her brain. Now recite the Lord's Prayer. And she does, while they destroy more neural pathways. Count backward from 100. She tries, she gets confused. Her words turn to nonsense. They keep cutting. She falls silent. The woman who sang. The woman who prayed. The woman who could walk and talk and dance and curtsy before the King of England. Gone. In 1 hour, they erased her. A student nurse assisting the procedure was so traumatized by what she witnessed that she quit medicine entirely afterward. She couldn't continue working in healthcare after participating in the destruction of a young woman who had done nothing wrong, except be born to a father who could not accept imperfection. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the day Rose Mary Kennedy was born. September 13th, 1918. The Spanish flu pandemic was at its peak. Boston's hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors were unavailable, treating dying patients who couldn't wait. When Rose Kennedy went into labor, her obstetrician was nowhere to be found. A nurse was present. She was trained to assist in deliveries, but the medical protocol of the era was absolute. A physician must preside over the birth, particularly for a family as prominent as the Kennedys. Rose's labor accelerated. The baby's head began to emerge, and the nurse made a decision that would destroy a life. She ordered Rose Kennedy to clamp her legs shut, to hold the baby's head in the birth canal until the doctor could arrive. For approximately 2 hours, the duration cited in major biographies, though some historians dispute the exact timing, the infant's head remained trapped, pressed against her mother's body, deprived of the oxygen her developing brain required to form properly. The doctor never came in time. When Rosemary Kennedy finally entered the world, the damage was already done. Hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, a neonatal brain injury resulting from oxygen deprivation. The nurse had followed the rules. The rules had broken the child. As Rosemary grew, her developmental delays became impossible to ignore. At 2 years old, when children typically navigate their environment with growing confidence, Rosemary struggled to sit up, struggled to crawl, struggled to walk. She was slower to speak, slower to develop fine motor skills, slower in nearly every milestone that parents anticipate and celebrate. And her younger siblings, they began overtaking her developmentally. Jack, born a year after Rosemary, then Kathleen, then Eunice. One by one, the younger children left their eldest sister behind. Joseph Kennedy did not tolerate weakness. He had clawed his way from Irish Catholic outsider to Wall Street titan to Hollywood power broker. He did not accept defeat. He could not countenance the notion that his firstborn daughter would be anything less than a perfect reflection of Kennedy ambition. Rosemary was shuffled between boarding schools, Sacred Heart in Providence, then another, then another. As her parents searched for the institution that would fix what was never broken, the curriculum that would cure what was not a disease, the miracle that would transform their daughter into someone she could never be. Then in 1938, everything changed. And for a brief shining moment, it changed for the better. Joseph Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to Great Britain. The entire family relocated to London, including the daughter whose disabilities had made her a source of constant anxiety and private shame. Rosemary was enrolled at a convent school run by the Assumption Sisters. They offered a Montessori program emphasizing hands-on learning, individualized packing, and practical life skills. For the first time in her chaotic educational history, Rosemary found an environment designed for her rather than against her. She flourished. Because she was older than the other students, she was given a role that transformed her self-perception, teaching assistant to the school's leader. For a young woman who had spent years being passed over, held back, and shipped between institutions that treated her as a problem to be solved, this position of modest responsibility was revolutionary. She was needed, she was capable, she was contributing. Her father wrote to Rose that this setting provided the ideal life for Rosemary. For once, he was right. In London, Rosemary discovered she could read with genuine confidence. Her favorite book was Winnie the Pooh, one of the few texts she could read fluently. She spent hours reading the adventures of Christopher Robin and Pooh Bear to younger children in her care. That she could master this book, perform it with expression for an appreciative audience, this represented something she had never experienced. Success, the triumph of her London years, came in May 1938. Rosemary was presented at the British Royal Court alongside her sister Kathleen. The presentation required mastering an elaborate curtsy, a complex physical performance executed before the King and Queen of England in front of the assembled aristocracy. Rosemary practiced for hours. She practiced until her legs ached. She practiced until she could execute every movement from muscle memory. When the moment came, she performed the curtsy perfectly. Cameras captured her afterward, radiant in white gown and feathers, a young woman who had proven to the world and to herself that she could achieve what others assumed was beyond her. Her diary from this period documents tea dances, concerts, outings with young men, the ordinary joys of a young woman discovering the pleasures of society. For perhaps the only time in her life, Rosemary Kennedy was not desperately struggling to keep up. She was not being evaluated against siblings who would always surpass her. She was not being told she was defective. She was simply living. Then the war came. As German forces advanced across Europe in 1939, Joseph Kennedy made the decision to send his family back to America. Rosemary pleaded with her father. She begged him not to move her from Belmont House, the one place where she had found stability, purpose, and happiness. She had finally discovered an environment where she could thrive. Joseph Kennedy tore her away from it anyway. And the transformation in Rosemary after her return to America was rapid and devastating. Rose Kennedy documented the change in her diary. In the year or so following her return from England, disquieting symptoms began to develop. Not only was there a noticeable retrogression in the mental skills she had worked so hard to attain, but her customary good nature gave way increasingly to tension and irritability. Rosemary began experiencing episodes of rage, screaming, throwing objects, breaking vases, striking out at people with enough force to cause injury. She reportedly began sneaking out at night. And the Kennedy family, obsessed with reputation and public image, feared what might happen if Rosemary encountered the wrong man during one of these nocturnal escapes. A pregnancy, a scandal, a permanent stain on the family name. Joseph Kennedy had been grooming his eldest son, Joe Jr., for the presidency. Jack was the backup plan. Every move the family made was calculated for political advantage. A disabled daughter who might embarrass them. That was a problem requiring a permanent solution. In the fall of 1941, Joseph Kennedy learned of a newer, more dramatic intervention. The prefrontal lobotomy. The procedure had been championed by Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, who promised it could transform patients who were problems to their families into useful members of society. The American Medical Association had issued clear warnings that the lobotomy was too experimental, its side effects too severe for general use. Joseph Kennedy did not care. The doctors promised the surgery would make his daughter calm, compliant, controllable. She would stop sneaking out. She would stop embarrassing the family. She would stop being a threat to his son's political futures. That was enough. He authorized the procedure without telling his wife, Rose. He did not consult his other children. He did not seek a second opinion from physicians who might have counseled against it. He simply scheduled the surgery that would destroy his daughter's mind. November 20th, 1941. 23-year-old Rosemary Kennedy was admitted to George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. She was not told what was about to happen to her. The surgeons drilled 2 holes in her skull, one on each side. They inserted a spatula-like instrument into her brain tissue. They began severing the connections of her prefrontal cortex. Dr. James Watts later described the procedure. "We went through the top of the head. She had a mild tranquilizing effect. We put an instrument inside and made the cuts at the end of the needle. They asked her to sing 'God Bless America.' They asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer. They asked her to count backward from 100. They used her responses to gauge how much of her brain they had destroyed. We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded," Dr. Freeman later explained. "When she began to become incoherent, we stopped. When she fell silent, they stopped cutting. The surgery lasted approximately 1 hour. The damage would last a lifetime. When Rosemary emerged from that operating table, the person she had been no longer existed. She could not walk. She could not speak in coherent sentences. She could not control her bladder or bowels. Her mental capacity had been reduced to approximately that of a 2-year-old child. The procedure that was supposed to make her manageable had made her helpless. The surgery that was supposed to eliminate the problem had created a catastrophe. Joseph Kennedy's first decision, after seeing the results, was to hide what he had done. He transferred Rosemary to Craig House, a psychiatric hospital in Beacon, New York, a facility that specialized in one thing above all else: discretion. Wealthy families sent their inconvenient relatives there to disappear. Rosemary was housed alone in a small cottage, forbidden from participating in activities with other patients, sequestered from view. The ambassador's daughter had become a prisoner. For 8 years, from 1941 to 1949, none of the Kennedy siblings knew where their sister was. John didn't know. Robert didn't know. Eunice, who had been closest to Rosemary, didn't know. Their father told them nothing. Rose Kennedy, desperate to see her daughter, was told by her husband that visiting would be too upsetting for Rosemary and would impede her adjustment. The truth was simpler and uglier. Joseph feared his wife would see the devastation and demand explanations he could not provide. He had authorized the surgery without her consent. He had destroyed their daughter without her knowledge. He could not let her witness the result. In 1949, Rosemary was transferred to St. Coletta School in remote Jefferson, Wisconsin, a small town hundreds of miles from anywhere the Kennedy name carried weight. Joseph financed construction of a private cottage where she would live, isolated even from the school's other residents. The prohibition on family contact remained absolute. 20 years. Not one of Rosemary's 8 siblings visited her. Not one letter from home reached her. Her mother was forbidden from seeing her own child. Joseph Kennedy told different lies to different family members. Rosemary is reclusive. She prefers privacy. She's teaching in the Midwest. She's doing well but needs her space. Each explanation was calibrated to prevent questions, prevent investigation, prevent anyone from discovering what he had done. And his plan worked. John Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Elected to the Senate in 1952. Elected President of the United States in 1960. Throughout his rise, his eldest sister sat in a cottage in Wisconsin, struggling to form complete sentences, learning to walk again with a shuffling limp, abandoned by every member of the family she had once been part of. Joseph Kennedy had succeeded. His sons achieved everything he had dreamed for them. And the daughter he sacrificed to make it possible had been erased so completely that most Americans had no idea she existed. Then, on December 19, 1961, Joseph Kennedy suffered a massive stroke on a Palm Beach golf course. The stroke left him paralyzed on his right side. It left him unable to speak. It left him trapped in a body that would not obey his commands, dependent on others for every basic function. The man who had rendered his daughter mute was now mute himself. The man who had made her incontinent now required help with his own bodily functions. The man who had hidden her away could no longer hide anything. For the first time in 20 years, someone other than Joseph Kennedy controlled the family. In early 1962, Rose Kennedy finally traveled to Wisconsin to see her daughter. 20 years had passed since Rosemary's surgery. Rose had not been permitted to visit. She had not been told the truth about what happened. She had spent 2 decades believing the lies her husband had constructed. Now Joseph was silenced by his stroke, and Rose was free to see for herself. She arrived at the Milwaukee airport. Rosemary was brought to meet her. When Rosemary spotted her mother across the terminal, the woman who had given birth to her, who had raised her through childhood, who had disappeared from her life the day she entered that operating room. She ran toward her. Rose opened her arms to embrace her daughter. And Rosemary's face changed. The anticipation dissolved into something harder, something older. She raised her fists and began beating her mother's chest, again and again, producing a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream, a primal noise of rage and grief and abandonment that she lacked the vocabulary to express any other way. The nuns rushed forward to pull her away. The lobotomy had not erased the past 20 years from Rosemary's memory. She knew her mother had not been there when she needed her most. Rose Kennedy, who had not authorized the surgery, who had been lied to about its aftermath, who had been forbidden from visiting her own child, stood in that airport absorbing blows from a daughter who blamed her for the abandonment. Joseph Kennedy had done this. Joseph Kennedy had made this. And Joseph Kennedy sat paralyzed in Palm Beach, unable to speak, while his wife absorbed the consequences of his decision. But something extraordinary came from the tragedy. The surviving Kennedy children learned the truth gradually, and the revelations transformed them. In February 1963, President John F. Kennedy delivered a message to Congress on mental health and mental retardation. He spoke of cutting institutionalization in half. He spoke of community-based care. He spoke of treating the disabled with dignity rather than warehousing them in remote facilities. His sister's suffering informed every word. Congress passed the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. JFK signed it into law on October 31, 1963, 22 days before his assassination in Dallas. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who had been closest to Rosemary before the lobotomy, channeled her grief into action. In 1962, she established Camp Shriver at her Maryland home, a summer program for children with intellectual disabilities. That camp evolved into the Special Olympics, officially founded in 1968. Today, the Special Olympics serves over 4.7 million athletes with intellectual disabilities in 170 countries worldwide. Every one of those athletes participates because Eunice could not save her sister. Ted Kennedy co-sponsored the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. He called it an Emancipation Proclamation for the Disabled. 26 million Americans with disabilities gained legal protections because one senator's sister had been destroyed by a father who saw disability as embarrassment. Rosemary Kennedy died on January 7, 2005, at age 86. She had outlived the father who lobotomized her by more than 3 decades. She had outlived the mother who failed to protect her by nearly 10 years. She had outlived John, assassinated. She had outlived Robert, assassinated. She had outlived Kathleen, killed in a plane crash. She had outlived Joe Jr., killed in World War II. In the end, the daughter Joseph Kennedy tried to erase proved more durable than almost everyone who had abandoned her. Her surviving siblings, Eunice, Jean, and Ted, were at her bedside when she died. The family that had hidden her for 20 years gathered to say goodbye to the sister they had been forbidden to know. Joseph Kennedy sought to erase his eldest daughter, fearing her existence threatened his son's political fortunes. Instead, she became the invisible architect of a transformation in how the world treats people with disabilities. Her erasure became her legacy. Her suffering became the foundation for legislation and institutions that have protected millions. And the father who decided she was too imperfect to be a Kennedy produced a daughter whose impact exceeded that of almost every sibling he had prioritized over her. Some erasures refused to stay erased. Here's the question that haunts me about this story. Rose Kennedy was forbidden from seeing her daughter for 20 years. She didn't defy her husband. She accepted his explanations. She stayed away. Should she have fought harder? Could she have? Remember the era, 1941 to 1961. A wife challenging her husband, especially a husband as powerful as Joseph Kennedy, risked everything: her marriage, her social position, her other children. But this was her daughter, her firstborn girl, the child she had carried and raised and loved. Some will say Rose was a victim too, of her husband's deception, of the era's expectations, of a system that gave fathers absolute authority over their families. Others will say a mother's duty to her child supersedes everything else, that she should have fought, should have demanded answers, should have refused to accept the lies. What do you think? Was Rose Kennedy a victim of her husband's cruelty, or complicit in her daughter's abandonment? I genuinely want to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. If you're still watching, you're part of a small group who actually want to understand how these tragedies happen, not just hear the headlines. You've seen a son exploit his mother's Alzheimer's for millions. You've seen a mother destroy her son's mind through unthinkable abuse and pay for it with her life. You've seen a father lobotomize his daughter to protect his son's political ambitions. But the next story I'm about to tell you is different. It's older, more visceral, and in some ways more horrifying than anything we've examined so far. Because this woman wasn't hidden for 5 years or 20 years. She was locked in an attic for 25 years. And when police finally found her, she weighed 55 pounds. This is Blanche Monnier. In 1875, she was celebrated as one of the most beautiful women in Poitiers, France. Dark curling hair, brilliant eyes, a smile that attracted suitors from across the region. By 1901, she was a living skeleton, naked, lying on a mattress encrusted with decades of filth, in a room so foul that police officers could barely stay long enough to document what they found. Her crime? She fell in love with the wrong man. It's May 23, 1901, Paris. The Attorney General receives an anonymous letter, The handwriting is careful, educated. The accusations are almost impossible to believe. I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years, in a word, in her own filth. The Monnier family is aristocratic, wealthy, deeply Catholic, impeccably connected. The father had served as dean of the Faculty of Letters at the University of Poitiers. The son works in local parliament. The widowed mother, Louise Monnier, embodies everything the conservative bourgeoisie admires about French respectability. These are not the kind of people who lock their daughters in attics. But the Attorney General orders an investigation anyway. That afternoon, Commissioner Butcherin of the Poitiers Police arrives at 21 Rue de la Visitation with an order from the Paris prosecutor. He knocks on the door of one of the city's most elegant mansions. He has no idea what he's about to find. The officers examine the ground floor methodically. Nothing unusual. Elegant furnishings, well-maintained rooms, the trappings of cultured respectability that confirm the Monniers' status among Poitiers elite. They proceed to the second floor. Each room is examined with growing frustration. Nothing appears amiss. Then they encounter a locked attic door, secured with a heavy chain and padlock. When the family hesitates to open it, police warn they will involve a judge if necessary. The door is finally unlocked. What follows will haunt the officers for the rest of their lives. The stench hits them first. The air was so unbreathable, the odor given off by the room was so rank, that it was impossible for us to stay any longer to proceed with our investigation. A toxic, putrid smell produced by decades of accumulated waste, so overwhelming that officers can barely remain in the room long enough to document what they find. Heavy curtains fall in clouds of dust when pulled aside. The shutters have to be pried from their hinges, so long have they remained sealed against the outside world. No natural light has entered this room for 25 years. And there, in the blackness that has been her world for a quarter-century, lies Blanche Monnier. The unfortunate woman was lying completely naked on a rotten straw mattress. All around her was formed a sort of crust made from excrement, fragments of meat, vegetables, fish, and rotten bread. She is 52 years old. She weighs 55 pounds. Her skin, deprived of sunlight for 25 years, is pallid and fragile as paper. The woman who had once been celebrated as one of Poitiers' most beautiful socialites, with her wealth of beautiful hair and big, brilliant eyes, has been reduced to a skeletal wraith who hasn't seen the sun since she was 27 years old. We also saw oyster shells and bugs running across Mademoiselle Monnier's bed. The police officers who entered that room would never forget what they witnessed. Some reportedly suffered nightmares for years afterward. One officer had to be physically removed from the scene after becoming violently ill. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to a time when Blanche Monnier was the envy of Poitiers. She was born March 1st, 1849, into an aristocratic family. Her father, Charles-Émile Monnier, served as dean of the Faculty of Letters at the university, a position that conferred intellectual prestige alongside the family's accumulated wealth. By her mid-20s, Blanche was known throughout the region for her extraordinary beauty. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing a wealth of beautiful hair and big, brilliant eyes. She was joyous, playful, and she attracted numerous suitors from across the region. In the rigid class structure of 19th-century France, where marriages among the bourgeoisie functioned as strategic alliances, Blanche represented a valuable prize. A beautiful daughter from a respectable family, her marriage to the right man could cement the Monniers' position among the elite for another generation. And then, around 1874, Blanche fell in love. With the wrong man. His name was Victor Kammel. He was an older provincial lawyer, respectable in his own way, but not wealthy, not connected, not Catholic. He was Protestant. To Louise Monnier, Blanche's mother, the relationship was unthinkable. A Protestant, a man without fortune, a lawyer from the provinces. Her daughter, her beautiful, valuable daughter, throwing herself away on someone so unsuitable. It could not be permitted. Louise demanded Blanche end the relationship. Blanche refused. She loved Victor Kamal. She didn't care about his religion or his modest income. She saw a future with him, a future built on genuine affection rather than social calculation. Her mother saw something else entirely. She saw rebellion. She saw disgrace. She saw a daughter who valued her own happiness above her family's reputation. And that was something Louise Monnier could not tolerate. What happened next would consume the remaining 40 years of Blanche Monnier's life. In 1876, Blanche Monnier disappeared from public life. Louise reported her daughter missing to police in 1875, a calculated lie that would provide cover for what came next. Some in Poitiers speculated that the beautiful socialite had eloped with her unsuitable lover. But Victor Kamal remained in Poitiers, alone, wondering what had happened to the woman he loved. The truth was far more sinister. Blanche had been confined to a small attic room in her own family home. The door was secured from the outside with a thick chain and padlock. The window was heavily shuttered and covered with dust-laden curtains. She would remain there for 25 years. Think about that number for a moment. 25 years. When Blanche entered that room, Ulysses S. Grant was President of the United States. Queen Victoria still had a quarter-century left on the British throne. The telephone had just been invented. The automobile didn't exist. By the time she was discovered, the world had transformed completely. Electric lights illuminated cities. Motorcars roared through streets. A new century had begun. And Blanche Monnier had experienced none of it. She had spent those 25 years in a room no larger than a prison cell, watching the seasons change only through the cracks in shuttered windows, hearing the sounds of the outside world but never being part of it. For the first 20 years, a nurse named Marie Fazy provided Blanche's care. According to later trial testimony, conditions during this period were tolerable, if imprisonment can ever be called tolerable. Blanche was bathed. Her room was cleaned. She could occasionally visit other parts of the house. She even played the piano for a time. But she was never allowed outside, never permitted to see Victor Kamal, never given the chance to live the life she had chosen for herself. Her mother had decided that if Blanche wouldn't marry appropriately, she wouldn't marry at all. If she wouldn't live by her mother's rules, she wouldn't live freely at all. In 1885, Victor Kamal died. 9 years into her captivity. The man Blanche had loved, the man for whom she was being punished, was gone. Any possibility of romantic resolution died with him. But Louise Monnier didn't release her daughter. The door stayed locked. The years kept passing. By this point, the imprisonment had taken on a logic of its own. Louise couldn't release Blanche because then she would have to explain what she had done. She couldn't admit her daughter had been locked away for nearly a decade because that admission would destroy the family's reputation far more thoroughly than any unsuitable marriage ever could. So the imprisonment continued, not because Victor Kamal was still a threat, he was dead, not because Blanche still posed any romantic danger, but because Louise Monnier had trapped herself in her own cruelty. The longer it went on, the harder it became to stop. On August 16, 1892, 16 years into her imprisonment, a neighbor passing beneath the shuttered window heard a voice. A woman's voice, cracked from years of screaming into silence. "What have I done to be locked up? I don't deserve this horrible torture. God must not exist then to let his creatures suffer in this way, and no one to come to my rescue." The neighbor kept walking. Think about that. Someone heard Blanche Monnier crying out for help, heard her questioning whether God existed because her suffering was so immense, and that person did nothing. They didn't knock on the door. They didn't report what they heard to the police. They didn't even mention it to other neighbors. They just kept walking. Because the Monniers were a respectable family. Because challenging them would mean risking their own social position. Because it was easier to convince themselves that whatever was happening inside that elegant mansion wasn't their business. And so Blanche remained imprisoned for another 9 years. In 1896, everything got worse. Marie Fazy, the nurse who had provided Blanche's care for 2 decades, died. Louise Monnier, now in her 70s, reportedly showing signs of her own mental decline, failed to hire an adequate replacement. In 1899, Two young, inexperienced servants took over Blanche's care. Juliette Dupuy and Eugenie Thébault. They struggled to manage her, and Louise provided minimal support. When a maid requested clean nightgowns and sheets for the incontinent Blanche, Louise refused. She will only tear or stain them again. The final 5 years of captivity saw Blanche descend into conditions that would shock the world. The room was no longer cleaned. The mattress was no longer changed. Food was thrown in, but Blanche could barely eat. She lay in her own waste. She was covered in sores. She was slowly starving to death. And all the while, Louise Monnier maintained her elegant life in the rooms below, attending church, hosting visitors, preserving the family's impeccable reputation, while her daughter rotted in the attic above. Louise Monnier went to confession. She received communion. She was respected by her community as a woman of faith and propriety. And every night she climbed into her comfortable bed in her comfortable room while her daughter, her own flesh and blood, lay naked on a mattress soaked in human waste, surrounded by rotting food and crawling insects, slowly dying of neglect. That is the face of evil, not dramatic, not monstrous in any obvious way, just an ordinary woman who convinced herself that her cruelty was justified. Which brings us back to May 23, 1901. Commissioner Butcherin stands in that attic room, barely able to breathe, staring at what remains of Blanche Monnier. Blanche is immediately wrapped in a blanket and rushed to the Hôtel Dieu hospital in Paris. Doctors initially fear she will die, her body so emaciated and weakened that survival seems improbable. Her organs are failing, her muscles have atrophied from decades of immobility, her skin is covered in sores and infections, she weighs less than a small child. But somehow, against all medical expectations, Blanche Monnier survives. Both Louise and Marcel Monnier are arrested that same day. An angry mob gathers outside the mansion, demanding justice for the woman they had allowed to waste away in filth while maintaining their elegant respectability in the rooms below. The crowd throws stones at the windows. They chant for the Monniers to be brought out and punished. For a moment, it seems like vigilante justice might prevail. Police have to form a human barrier around the house to prevent the mob from breaking down the doors. Against all odds, Blanche survives. Once stabilized, she expresses profound relief at simple human dignities she had been denied for decades. How wonderful it is to be clean again, and to eat, and no longer be imprisoned. The joy of a bath, the taste of adequate food, the sensation of fresh air. These basic experiences overwhelmed a woman who had been denied them since her mid-20s. Hospital workers, nuns, and priests reported something surprising. She was not mad at all. In fact, she was hard to please, noting that she liked perfume and flowers. The woman who had spent 25 years in darkness still remembered beauty. Still craved it. Still deserved it. Despite everything that had been done to her, Blanche Monnier had retained her humanity. Her mind was intact. Her spirit, though battered, had not been broken. The newspapers called her La Séquestrée de Poitiers, the sequestered woman of Poitiers. Her story became an international sensation. Reporters from across Europe descended on the quiet French city. Photographers tried to capture images of the emaciated woman who had survived a quarter-century of imprisonment. Editorials demanded answers. How could this happen in a civilized society? How could a respectable family commit such atrocities? How could neighbors hear screams and do nothing? The questions that people asked about the Monnier case are the same questions we're still asking today. About Brooke Astor, about Rosemary Kennedy, about every victim whose suffering was hidden behind wealth and respectability. Louise Monnier never faced trial. The stress of arrest, combined with her advanced age and poor health, proved fatal. She died approximately 15 days after her arrest, around June 7, 1901. Reports vary regarding her final words. Some sources suggest she said, "Oh, my poor Blanche." Others claimed she expressed no remorse, asking, "All this fuss about nothing," failing to understand why anyone was upset about her treatment of her daughter. I've thought about those two possible final statements a lot, and I think the second one is more likely to be true. Because people who do what Louise Monnier did don't usually see themselves as monsters. They convince themselves that their cruelty is justified, that their victim deserved it, that they had no choice. Louise probably went to her grave believing she had done the right thing, that Blanche's disobedience had left her no alternative, that locking her daughter away for 25 years was somehow an act of love or protection or family honor. That's the terrifying thing about this story. Louise Monnier wasn't insane. She was just convinced she was right. Marcel Monnier faced trial alone, beginning October 7, 1901. The proceedings lasted 5 days, featuring extensive testimony from servants, doctors, carpenters, and neighbors that revealed the complex reality behind the sensational headlines. Marcel's defense presented him as trapped between a domineering mother and a sister whose severe mental illness he lacked the legal authority to properly address. Witnesses testified that Marcel had repeatedly asked his mother to allow Blanche's admission to a hospital. Louise refused each time, citing her deceased husband's explicit wishes that Blanche never be sent to an asylum. Marcel was initially found guilty and sentenced to 15 months in prison. But he appealed, serving as his own attorney, and won. The grounds for acquittal exposed a critical gap in French law. No duty to rescue existed in the penal code with sufficient specificity to convict him. In other words, Marcel Monnier walked free because there was no law requiring him to help his own sister. The law had failed Blanche Monnier, just as her family, her neighbors, and her society had failed her. Here's what I keep thinking about with this story. The neighbors heard Blanche screaming for years. Not weeks, not months, years. They heard her cries, "What have I done to be locked up? I don't deserve this horrible torture." And they did nothing. The servants witnessed the horror, but they were terrified of Madame Monnier and dared not speak out against their employer. The community deferred to aristocratic authority. They convinced themselves that whatever happened inside that elegant mansion was not their concern. It took an anonymous letter from someone whose identity died with them to finally break the silence. One person, after 25 years, found the courage to speak. We don't know who wrote that letter. We don't know what finally pushed them to act. We don't know if they were a servant, a neighbor, a distant relative, or a complete stranger who had somehow learned the truth. All we know is that one person decided they could no longer stay silent, and that decision saved Blanche Monnier's life. Would you have written that letter? Would you have challenged a powerful family, risked your own position, spoken up when everyone around you stayed silent? Or would you have walked past that shuttered window, heard the screaming, and convinced yourself it wasn't your business? I'd like to think I would have done differently. But I also know that everyone who stayed silent for 25 years probably thought the same thing. They probably told themselves that if things got really bad, they would intervene, that if the situation became truly serious, they would act, that they were just waiting for the right moment. And while they waited, Blanche Monnier wasted away to 55 pounds. Blanche spent the remaining 12 years of her life in a psychiatric hospital in Blois. And here's something that surprised me when I researched this story. The staff described her as lovely and kind to everyone there. After 25 years of imprisonment, after conditions that would have broken anyone, after being reduced to a 55-pound skeleton by her own mother, she was still capable of kindness. She made friends among the staff. She enjoyed flowers and perfumes, small pleasures that reminded her of the life she had lost. She read books. She had conversations. She lived. Not fully, not the way she would have if she had been free to marry Victor Kamal and build a life with him, but she lived. And in the end, isn't that its own form of victory? To survive what should have destroyed you, to retain your humanity when everything conspired to strip it away. Blanche Monnier died on October 13, 1913, at age 64. She outlived her mother by 12 years. The woman who had been celebrated as one of Poitiers' most beautiful socialites died in obscurity, in a psychiatric facility, largely forgotten by the public that had briefly been outraged by her story. But she died free. She died clean. She died in the light. And for Blanche Monnier, after 25 years in darkness, that was something. The most beautiful socialite in Poitiers became a 55-pound skeleton. The aristocratic family that prized reputation above all else became the most notorious scandal in France. The mother who imprisoned her daughter died within 15 days of her own arrest. And the man Blanche loved, Victor Kamal, died in 1885, 9 years into her captivity. She never saw him again, never knew what happened to him. Spent the remaining 16 years of her imprisonment mourning a man who was already gone. But Blanche outlived her tormentor, and she spent her final years described by those who knew her as lovely and kind. Some prisons cannot destroy what matters most. 4 stories. 4 women destroyed by their families. A philanthropist starved by her son. A mother murdered by the child she damaged. A daughter lobotomized by her ambitious father. A socialite locked in an attic for 25 years. But the 5th story is different, because this woman didn't wait to be rescued. She didn't die in captivity. She didn't become a victim of her family's schemes. She fought back, she escaped, and she won. This is Margaret Astor Carey. An Astor, one of America's wealthiest, most powerful families. Her Aunt Caroline ruled the exclusive 400 of New York society, deciding who mattered and who would be forever excluded from polite company. Her husband was a Dutch diplomat who tormented her for 14 years and threatened to have her committed to an asylum if she ever tried to leave. When she finally escaped, her own brother testified against her in court. Her aunt personally forced her back to her abuser. But Margaret Astor Carey refused to stay destroyed. She fled to the frontier, to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to find the freedom her Fifth Avenue fortune couldn't buy. And then she built a life that proved the greatest revenge is living well. Coming up, the woman who escaped the Astors and made them watch her win. In the Gilded Age, no family in America was more powerful than the Astors. And no Astor was more powerful than Caroline. The Mrs. Astor ruled New York society with absolute authority. She determined who belonged to the exclusive 400, the only people in New York, she declared, who truly mattered. If you weren't on her list, you didn't exist. If you were on her list, you followed her rules. And her rules were simple. Scandal was unacceptable. Divorce was unthinkable. Family reputation trumped everything, including the happiness, safety, and well-being of individual family members. Margaret Laura Carey was born in 1853 into this world of absolute privilege and absolute expectation. Her maternal grandparents were William Backhouse Astor Sr. and Margaret Rebecca Armstrong, the heart of the Astor dynasty. She grew up in mansions, attended the finest events, wore the most expensive gowns, and understood from childhood that her role was to marry well and reflect glory on the family name. In 1875, at age 22, she fulfilled that expectation perfectly. She married Baron Alphonse Lambert Eugene Ritter de Stuurs, a Dutch diplomat 12 years her senior. It was exactly the kind of match the Astors valued. American wealth merged with European nobility, the family's status confirmed, a perfect alliance. And a perfect nightmare, because what happened behind closed doors would define the next 14 years of Margaret's life. The Baron was a diplomat, charming in public, respected in the circles that mattered. And in private, according to court records from her eventual divorce trial, he subjected his wife to what was described as everyday cruelty. He tormented her psychologically, humiliated her in front of servants and guests, controlled every aspect of her life with obsessive precision. And he deployed his most devastating weapon, the threat to have her committed to the Hospice de la Salpêtrière, a notorious Parisian asylum infamous throughout Europe for its brutal treatment of women deemed hysterical by their husbands or families. Think about what that meant. In the 19th century, a husband could have his wife declared mentally unstable with terrifying ease. Commitment to an asylum would strip Margaret of everything, her children, her fortune, her freedom. She would disappear into an institution, and no one would question it. The diagnosis of hysteria was applied to any woman who showed independence, spirit, or resistance to male authority. A woman who wanted a divorce, clearly hysterical. A woman who complained about her husband's cruelty, obviously unstable. A woman who tried to leave, proof that she needed to be locked away for her own good. For 14 years, Margaret performed the ultimate acting role of her life, the perfect aristocratic wife. She smiled through public appearances, hosted European nobility at elaborate dinner parties, maintained the flawless facade that her family's reputation demanded, all while secretly fearing for her sanity, her freedom, and her survival. Every day, she woke up knowing that one wrong move could land her in an asylum. One argument, one moment of defiance, one attempt to leave, and she could lose everything. The Baron used her fear like a leash. He didn't have to physically restrain her. He didn't have to lock her in a room. He just had to remind her periodically that he could make her disappear whenever he chose. And Margaret's own family, the mighty Astors with all their wealth and influence, they sided with the Baron because divorce was worse than suffering. Scandal was worse than abuse. The family name mattered more than Margaret's well-being. By 1889, Margaret had reached her breaking point. She made her first attempt to escape. We don't know exactly what happened. The historical records are fragmentary, but we know she tried to leave her husband. We know she sought help from somewhere. And we know what happened next. Word reached her Aunt Caroline. The Mrs. Astor descended upon the situation with the swift efficiency of a general crushing a rebellion. She personally forced Margaret back to Paris, back to her abusive husband, back to the nightmare. The message was clear: divorce was not an option. Family reputation mattered more than Margaret's suffering. The Astor name could not be stained by scandal. Margaret would endure, or she would be destroyed. Margaret returned to her husband. But she didn't give up. She started planning, waiting, looking for another way out. And she found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. Margaret's uncle, John Jacob Astor, showed her photographs of a thriving frontier city. Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He probably didn't mention what that city had become known for among the desperate wives of America's elite. Sioux Falls was the Mecca for the mismated. South Dakota's revolutionary divorce laws required only 90 days of residency, and they accepted grounds for dissolution that would be laughed out of courts in New York, Boston, or any other respectable eastern city. Mental cruelty, incompatibility, failure to provide adequate support. In South Dakota, these were legitimate reasons to end a marriage. In New York, they were considered the normal expectations of married life. Women from across the country, wealthy women, society women, women who had no other options, traveled to Sioux Falls to escape marriages that had become prisons. They called it the divorce colony. And in 1891, Margaret Astor Carey decided to join it. She fled to Sioux Falls, accompanied by a man named William Elliot, publicly her chaperone, privately her lover, and her faithful dog, Tweedle. She took up residence at the Cataract House Hotel and began her 90-day waiting period while newspapers tracked her every movement. The Philadelphia Record breathlessly reported, "Now that a niece of William Astor has joined the divorce colony in Sioux Falls, the South Dakota style of severing matrimonial bonds may become more popular than heretofore." Suddenly, this remote frontier outpost found itself hosting genuine American royalty, in pursuit of something all their millions couldn't buy back east. Legal freedom. Margaret tried to integrate herself into local society. She donated 3 elaborate stained glass windows to St. Augusta Episcopal Church, a gesture of goodwill meant to show that she was a woman of faith and respectability, not the scandalous adventuress the newspapers painted her as. It backfired spectacularly. Bishop William Hobart Hare, a man who had gladly accepted substantial Astor family philanthropy for years, publicly condemned her presence in his city as fundamentally immoral. The same church that had taken Astor money for its missionary work now declared that an Astor seeking freedom from an abusive marriage was morally unacceptable. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but in 1891 it was also completely normal. As her February 1892 trial date approached, Margaret braced herself for battle. She expected her husband to fight dirty. She expected the press to sensationalize every detail. She expected society to judge her harshly. What she didn't expect was that her own blood would deliver the cruelest blow of all. Unlike typical divorce proceedings in Sioux Falls, where defendants simply failed to appear and cases proceeded by default. Baron de Stewers mounted an aggressive defense through his legal team. This meant Margaret would be forced to publicly recount every humiliating detail of her 14-year ordeal, in a courtroom packed with spectators and reporters from across the nation. She testified about his cruelty, his threats, his schemes to steal her inheritance, his plans to have her declared insane. The packed courtroom heard testimony about sustained psychological abuse that moved even the jaded residents of Sioux Falls. And then came the moment that would haunt Margaret forever. Her own brother, Arthur Astor Carey, took the witness stand. But he appeared for the defense, not to support his sister. In a betrayal that would have impressed Judas Iscariot himself, Arthur testified against his own flesh and blood. He supported the Baron's claims. He said his brother-in-law had treated Margaret with consistent kindness. He sided with her abuser, against his own sister. This wasn't sibling rivalry. It was a cold, calculated family decision. The Astors would rather see Margaret destroyed in court than risk their social standing by supporting her quest for freedom. Arthur's testimony represented the family's official position: sacrifice Margaret rather than allow the scandal of divorce. I want you to imagine that for a moment. You've spent 14 years being tormented by your husband. You finally found the courage to escape. You've traveled across the country to a frontier town where you know no one. You've subjected yourself to public scrutiny and humiliation. And then your own brother, the person who grew up with you, who shared your childhood, who should have loved you unconditionally, walks into that courtroom and lies. He tells the world that you're making it all up, that your husband was kind to you, that you're the problem. That's what Margaret Astor Carey experienced. Her family didn't just fail to protect her, they actively participated in her destruction. And yet, despite everything, Margaret prevailed. Despite her brother's betrayal, despite everything, Margaret's testimony proved powerful enough. On March 5, 1892, the court granted her divorce decree. After 14 years of abuse and 2 grueling years of legal warfare against both her husband and her own family, she was finally free. And then she did something that scandalized everyone who was watching. 2 days later, on March 7, 1892, she married William Elliot. 2 days. It had to be the fastest divorced remarriage turnaround in American history. Her critics saw it as proof that she'd been scheming all along, that her relationship with Elliot had been more than professional, that the whole divorce had been a cover for adultery. Margaret saw it differently. She had escaped, she had won, and she had found a man who actually treated her with respect and kindness. Why wait? She had spent 14 years in a prison of a marriage. She had spent 2 more years fighting for her freedom. She had watched her family betray her in the most public way possible. What did she owe to anyone's expectations anymore? The Astor family's response was immediate. Margaret and William Elliot found themselves banished from American high society, permanently. They faced a stark choice: remain in New York as social lepers, forever excluded from the circles they had once dominated, or reinvent themselves elsewhere. They chose exile. They relocated to England, where divorce carried significantly less stigma, and where a dubious count and countess could still command considerable respect among those unfamiliar with their American scandal. But here's what the Astors hadn't counted on. Margaret retained control of substantial wealth. Her business acumen proved every bit as sharp as her survival instincts. The family that had tried to destroy her had failed to cut off her access to the fortune that continued to fund her new life. In 1899, she commissioned a 5-story building at 206 9th Avenue in New York City, proving she maintained valuable American real estate investments and the connections to manage them from abroad. In 1910, Margaret made a bold statement. She purchased Hyam Park, a magnificent estate near Canterbury in Kent, for £17,500. Then she commissioned an extensive renovation. The renovation cost £50,000, 3 times the estate's original purchase price. This wasn't just buying a house. This was building a palace that announced her complete financial independence. A palace that said, You tried to destroy me, and I built something grander than anything you could have imagined. Every room, every garden, every carefully chosen piece of furniture was a statement of defiance. The Astors had expected her to slink away in shame. Instead, she built an estate that rivaled their own. Personal tragedy struck in 1903. William Elliot died in a racing accident at the Lerby Hill climb in France. Margaret was widowed at around 50 years old. But she had experienced something rare. 10 years of genuine love, partnership, and mutual respect in her second marriage, something that had been entirely absent from her first. She continued maintaining Higham Park as a magnificent showcase estate. While her former family members likely assumed she was suffering in poverty and deserved disgrace, Margaret was building an empire. She managed her investments shrewdly. She cultivated connections in English society. She lived well, not out of spite, but because she had finally earned the right to enjoy her own life on her own terms. When Margaret finally died peacefully at Higham Park on July 9, 1911, she left behind the ultimate proof of her triumph. Her son, Louis Zaborowski, inherited a staggering fortune. He became the fourth richest person under 21 in the world. Cash of £11 million. Real estate in the United States, including 7 acres of Manhattan and several blocks on Fifth Avenue. Louis would go on to achieve considerable fame in his own right by creating the legendary Chitty Bang Bang racing cars, the vehicles that would later inspire Ian Fleming's beloved children's story and movie. Think about that for a moment. The brother who testified against Margaret watched her son become one of the richest young men in the world. The aunt who forced her back to her abuser watched her niece build a fortune that dwarfed what they had tried to deny her. The family that valued reputation above all else created a scandal that made international headlines and proved that the woman they tried to destroy was stronger than all of them combined. The mighty Astor family sacrificed Margaret to protect their reputation. But her story became infinitely more compelling than their stuffy social conformity. She transformed herself from a society ornament into a pioneering woman who chose authentic love over hollow prestige, personal freedom over family approval, hard-won financial independence over inherited dependency. And most satisfying of all, she proved that being kicked out of your inheritance can lead to building an even greater fortune. One earned through courage, intelligence, and determination, rather than mere accident of birth. Some prisons look like mansions. Some rescuers have to rescue themselves. And some families don't deserve the loyalty they demand. Margaret Astor Carey understood all three. Here's the question I want to leave you with from Margaret's story. Her own brother testified against her in court. He supported the man who had abused her for 14 years. He chose family reputation over his sister's freedom. Is there any family loyalty that should survive that kind of betrayal? Margaret never reconciled with Arthur. She built her life without him. She proved she didn't need him. But was cutting him off the right choice? Or should she have tried to forgive, to rebuild the relationship? I genuinely don't know where I fall on this. Some betrayals seem unforgivable. Others, maybe context matters. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. 5 women, billions of dollars, centuries of suffering, and in every single case people knew. They saw, they heard, they documented, and they did nothing. The nurses at 778 Park Avenue knew Brooke Astor was suffering. They bought her socks with their own money because her son wouldn't approve the expense. The guests at Barbara Beekelen's Paris dinner parties knew something was deeply wrong. They got up and left, but they didn't call anyone who could help. The Kennedy siblings knew their father was hiding something about Rosemary. They accepted his explanations and didn't ask questions for 20 years. The neighbors in Poitiers heard Blanche Monnier screaming for decades. They walked past her shuttered window and convinced themselves it wasn't their business. New York society knew Margaret Astor Carey was being abused. They sided with her husband and her family because scandal was worse than suffering. These stories aren't ancient history. Brooke Astor died in 2007. The nurses who witnessed her abuse are still alive. The building staff who saw her deteriorate still live in New York. The question isn't whether this could happen today. The question is whether it's happening right now. In some penthouse, some estate, some respectable family, while neighbors convince themselves it's none of their business. Would you do differently? I'd like to think I would. But then again, so would everyone who stayed silent in these 5 stories. So would the neighbors who heard Blanche screaming. So would the staff who saw Brooke suffering. So would the guests who watched Barbara's sanity unravel. They all probably told themselves they would have done something if it was really serious. And then they didn't. But here's what gives me hope. Sometimes the suffering creates something meaningful. Rosemary Kennedy's tragedy became the foundation for the Special Olympics, 4.7 million athletes in 170 countries. Her pain informed the Americans with Disabilities Act, protecting 26 million Americans. Philip Marshall sacrificed his inheritance to save his grandmother, and then founded Beyond Brooke to help other families facing elder abuse. Margaret Astor Carey's escape proved that even the most powerful families can't control a determined woman. The victims in these stories didn't choose their suffering, but some of them, or those who loved them, transformed that suffering into change. Rosemary's erasure became legislation that protects millions. Brooke's abuse became a catalyst for elder justice reform. Margaret's escape became proof that women can survive family betrayal and thrive. Even Blanche's discovery changed French law, contributing to the development of duty to rescue, statutes that didn't exist before her case. Brooke Astor, Barbara Buchanan, Rosemary Kennedy, Blanche Monnier, Margaret Astor Carey. 5 women who deserved protection and received none. 5 women whose wealth bought their abusers time, silence, and escape from consequences. 5 women whose stories prove that money isn't protection. It's ammunition for whoever controls it. But also 5 women who, in different ways, refuse to be forgotten. Brooke's charitable legacy lives on in the institutions she funded. Barbara's story became a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness and family dysfunction. Rosemary's suffering created movements that have helped millions. Blanche's discovery exposed the cruelty that aristocratic respectability can hide. Margaret's escape proved that survival and success are the greatest revenge. Their stories matter because they could be anyone's story. Anyone's grandmother, anyone's sister, anyone's mother, anyone's daughter. And the only thing that stops these stories from repeating is people who refuse to look away. If you made it this far, thank you. These aren't easy stories to hear. They're not comfortable. They don't have neat, happy endings, except for Margaret, who earned hers through sheer force of will. But I think they're important. Because the more we understand how these things happen, the harder it becomes to convince ourselves that it's not our business. I want to know what you think. Which of these 5 stories affected you most? What would you have done in Philip Marshall's position? Sacrifice your inheritance to save a family member? Would you have written the anonymous letter that saved Blanche Monnier? Do you think Rose Kennedy should have defied her husband to see her daughter? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to see more stories like this, investigations into the dark side of wealth, power, and family, subscribe and hit the bell. This is just the beginning. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.